profound thanks to the organisers, Uskali, Mäki, Olivia, Bina, and Marta, Varanda. It's so lovely to have been invited, so thank you very, very much. Part of me took the task that we've been set to reflect 20 years on, perhaps a little too literally. 20 years ago today exactly, 20th of January 1997, in the USA, Bill Clinton was sworn in for his second term. In his speech, he noted how a new century is almost upon us, another time to choose. If the 19th century spread the US nation from coast to coast, the 20th century would be about harnessing the Industrial Revolution to our values of free enterprise, conservation, and human decency. At the dawn of the 21st century, a free people must now choose to shape the forces of the information age and the global society to unleash the limitless potential of all our people. Elsewhere in his inauguration speech, he identified certain contexts critical not only for the work of governance as he saw it, but for us, for the horizons of the social sciences at the end of the 20th century. He stressed those people moving from welfare to work, and those of you who know the history of the States will know that welfare to work programs were one of his central legacies and crucial in transforming the economic situation of the US. He mentioned those scientists in the midst of decoding the blueprint for human life. And he mentioned the need to build bonds with nations that were once the US's adversaries. And at that moment, because I suppose this moment is all about reflecting on the 1996 report. So I was a graduate student in the US, Johns Hopkins, which was founded on the German 19th century model and was a profoundly interdisciplinary place. And I think it's worth remembering that moment of the mid-90s, certainly for me as an interpretive social scientist and historian. The social sciences were absolutely a fizz, with incursions and eruptions of brilliant interdisciplinary thought. I'm thinking of the completely transformational work of Homi Bhabha, Eve Sedgwick, Judith Butler, Gayatri Spivak, David Harvey, and of course, Immanuel Wallerstein. That interdisciplinary moment certainly made me as a scholar, and the questions that it raised, I think, are still absolutely central to the social sciences and in many ways have not yet been fully worked through 20 years on. It's difficult, of course, not to be aware of what is happening today, a few hours hence, to the west of Lisbon in Washington. And I certainly don't want to be taken to be assuming a priori that what happens in the US is more important than what happens in the rest of the world. And indeed, this was one of the very strong messages of the 1996 report, which emphasized so clearly the need, the urgency to shift the center of gravity in terms of our foundational categories, models, the voices to whom we listen, and indeed our attention in general. Nor do I want simply to be holding up a better age that is now gone, but rather I want to hold in view the braids of the socio-political and economic moment that I think absolutely stretch from the 1980s at least. Obviously, you could trace things further and further back, but the braids that stretch from the 1980s to the present today, in which the exigencies of our current moment in 2017 have to be thought. So the braids that continue and also wanting to bring into visibility the now, what might be new now in 2017 that was not apparent in 1997. For, in particular, the social sciences. And two very obvious differences that very much struck me when I was rereading the Gulbenkian report was that genetics did not unfold in the way that might have been imagined as before the human genome had been decoded. So that moment in 1996, there was a sense that genetics, a certain kind of dominant deterministic genetics, might gain a foothold. We now know that genomics, metabolomics, the life sciences, their models are much, much more complex, and the need for the social sciences is greater than ever in terms of understanding the intersection of the so-called social and the neurological. And of course, the geopolitical world that Clinton was describing in his inauguration talk is almost certainly not the one that we need to be considering today. And I think that today's inauguration cannot but be an important part of those shifts in geopolitical and political, economic and social life that I think have to be front and central in our task before us at this conference. After all, the potential of interdisciplinarity, if it continues to have one, must surely be tied to its ability to touch and intervene in the world. And I was struck by the question after one of the talks yesterday, expecting there to be more discussion of, post-fact, the post-fact world. And I suppose I was imagining that there might be two. And so it was interesting to see what topics are and are perhaps not being discussed at this conference. And that phrase, I think, absolutely demands interrogation. I'm certainly not saying we are living in a post-fact world, but the sense that that has been circulating as a potential descriptor, I think, is crucial to engage with. So in the remainder of my time, I'm going to try to do two things. First, talk briefly about my own interdisciplinary scholarship that crosses the social sciences, humanities, and the life sciences. And that part of the talk might sound as though it comes at a rather oblique angle to what I've just said about our current moment. And then briefly at the end, make some broader claims about where I think opening the social sciences and the ongoing promise of interdisciplinarity might be today. In the last decade, I've worked both on my own, but particularly in collaboration with many other researchers from the social sciences, the humanities, the arts, and the life sciences. And I've spent most of my time in the strange spaces of what are often called the psi disciplines, so psychiatry, psychology, the cognitive neuroscience, and indeed psychoanalysis. Which many would say is not a science, and that debate has been fundamental since the very birth of psychoanalysis. And my time in those spaces has been devoted both to the history of the psi disciplines, particularly from the 19th century fin de siècle, and as they continue into the 20th century and into the present. And I've been particularly interested in how the current interdisciplinary domain of the brain and the mind, how those models and how that work and how that research takes up, works with, and occludes, makes invisible other models that can be found in the archives of the history of the human sciences. And so I suppose that the common narrative is, cognitive science gained incredible potency over the last 20 years. We are in the neuro age. What does that mean? A lot of concern on the part of certain social scientists, a number of humanities scholars. And obviously that is one discourse that one can use to understand what has been going on. But I suppose my interest is in seeing the longer at least 100 years of research on the brain and mind that have been feeding into and are still profoundly evident in the neurosciences today. And I'm thinking back to our last keynote of yesterday evening, Bjorn's talk, in which he talked about the challenge of engaging with neuroscientific researchers who might have received a very, very different training from many of us. Though I would also note that the neurosciences are such a profoundly interdisciplinary set of disciplines and interstitial disciplines that many of the neuroscientists I work with have actually got first degrees in philosophy, anthropology, social sciences. So I think that we need to kind of attend to the sort of changing configuration of how trainings are working. So my interest in the current site of the brain and mind sciences is in part because I'm interested in whether the current neuroscientific turn offers interesting openings for tracing and accounting for the enmeshment of the biological, the psychological, and the social in the makeup of the human subject. And I suppose the starting point here, which is a very familiar one to many of you in the room from the social sciences, is that certainly a large part of geography, where I come from, and also sociology and social anthropology, has had a very clear desire to maintain a distance from biology in the last quarter century. And I think that task, the urgency of the task of how the social sciences actually work with and engage and theorize the biological, I think the urgency of that task cannot be overstated. In my work and through my collaborations, I've been keen to challenge some of the dominant ways in which the interdisciplinary spaces in the brain and mind sciences, but also in general, are being conceptualized. And I've been keen to try, along with my colleagues, to open up the topologies and the traffic of these interdisciplinary spaces as they've lately emerged, whether those of the medical humanities, a field in which I also work, or research that attempts to move beyond the social sciences into the life sciences or indeed into the humanities. In particular, my collaborators and I have been committed to disrupting an intellectual economy in which all the kind of interpretive power and the animating hermeneutic liveliness is accorded to the humanities, and all the hard-nosed scientific expertise by the biological and biomedical sciences. And so I'm trying to think a little bit differently about how the actual division of labour might work and what the histories of the human sciences over the last century might allow us to think with about disrupting, I suppose, divisions of labour in terms of who does what in these interdisciplinary spaces. I argue that for interdisciplinarity to fulfil its potential today, it should escape from the straitjacket in which it is often bound, and inhabit a much more experimental and risky way of working with and across disciplinary domains. And so I haven't got time to go into it now, but I have spent quite a lot of time writing about this. There are many kinds and practices of interdisciplinarity, but one dominant model could be seen as a layer cake model, in which there are different layers of reality that are kind of cut out from reality and given to particular disciplinary experts. So in a lot of the interdisciplinary projects that have been top-down initiatives, there's this desire you find the scientist who will do certain scientific tasks, you find the bioethicist who will be able to reflect on the ethical implications of that science, you find the social scientist who will perhaps provide a little bit of context, you'll find a philosopher who will help you parse the complexity of the categories you're using. That is a layer cake model, and I think that often it doesn't actually move beyond or work creatively enough with both the legacies of the disciplines. I don't think it's simply bioethics that is addressing ethics. I think social sciences and scientists themselves have a lot to contribute to making ethics today. And similarly, I suppose we're talking about the social sciences in particular. A lot of my work has been about how to try and allow social scientific models and formulations to feed into the practice of the life sciences, rather than kind of in some ways outsource the task of experimentation to lab scientists. And so particularly my colleague Des Fitzgerald and I, who write a lot together, we've been thinking about how to encourage different practices of experimentation, both inside and outside laboratories, and as much with the social sciences and the humanities and the arts as in the sciences. And again, this could be a much longer paper, but I'm very interested in the 20th century history of experiment across disciplines and what it might mean to harvest the legacies of experimental practice in various aesthetic forms, and how that might also open up how we think about experiment in the social sciences and in the life sciences. And one of the central interests in working with experiment is the desire to try to bring, if we think about experiments as arranging entities, people, implements, apparatuses, spaces, experiments hold the potential to bring people, tools, technologies, schemas, and ideas into all sorts of configurations. And if you set up experiments differently with different kinds of people and tools from how they are often done when they're so-called black boxed, is there the possibility that something different might actually unfold in terms of the kind of epistemological frameworks or findings or entities or data or analyses that might become possible? And I think often nothing happens, but I hold the possibility open that something different might happen. And I suppose this was a summary, I think, of what I've just said. And I suppose the piece where we formulated this account most fully, we published in 2015 in Theory, Culture and Society. And it's also in part elaborated in the book that you kindly mentioned, which you don't even need to buy because it's entirely open access. So, and this is meant to be a little bit of a kind of behind-the-scenes account of working in interdisciplinary projects, in which we also try to disrupt the way in which interdisciplinarity is talked about. Maybe I have time to say a little bit about that later in the paper. So the three large interdisciplinary projects in which I've been involved at Durham are Hearing the Voice. I'll put them all down. So Hearing the Voice is an ongoing project which runs till 2020, which is about the experience of hearing a voice that no one else can hear. And which often is called a project on auditory hallucinations, because 20th century and 21st century psychiatry has often grabbed and named that experience of hearing a voice that no one else hears, and categorizing it as a psychopathological experience. And so one of the interdisciplinary premises of the project is, what if you start with the flattest account of that, you describe it, a voice that no one else hears, and what then opens up in terms of the kinds of phenomena that become visible and need to be brought together. And obviously at that point, anthropology and theology become central. Hearing the voice of God or gods are hearing voices that no one else often hears. Then opening the longue durée, because there are many medieval experts, literary scholars and historians working on that project, because the hearing of voices in those many medieval centuries, I think, offers very different accounts of how we might attend to the experience of hearing a voice. Hubbub is the project that I've been running inside the Wellcome Trust for the last 2 years, which is on rest. And again, the starting point there, I suppose a little bit similar to hearing the voice, is that rest is a incredibly rich concept that can be addressed from a range of starting points, and it is fundamentally a physiological aesthetic. Music cannot be thought of outside of the category of rest. Musical form is built around musical rest. Clinically, the rest is prescribed in umpteen different ways, though we actually know very little about what counts as rest clinically. Historically, what counts as rest anthropologically. So I'll say a little bit more about that once I get past this slide. And then the third project, which I won't have time to talk about today, is on wandering minds. And so within the cognitive sciences, particularly cognitive neuroscience at the moment, in the last decade there's been an absolute upsurge in interest in mind wandering, because the older models of the brain that were dominant in the 1980s and 1990s within the neurosciences, which in turn were built on cognitive psychology from the cognitive era of the post-Second World War period, were very much built on the assumption that the mind is largely responding to the external world. And so a lot of the experiments that cognitive psychologists use are about understanding how the mind responds to external stimuli for a whole range of reasons, both psychologically and in terms of neuroanatomical experiments. So there was a serendipitous finding in the sciences that took place in different laboratories at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, that showed that a lot of the suppositions about how the brain worked were actually not quite right, because many brain networks were actually more active rather than less active when the brain was not responding to something. So the older model was that the brain responds to the outside world, and then to find out what the brain is doing, you subtract the activity of the brain when it's responding to the outside world from the activity when it is simply resting. So that is called the subtraction model. I'm kind of simplifying hugely. At a key moment, first arguably in 1995 and then continuing, there were 3 big papers in 2001, it became clear that actually the brain, many connected parts of the brain are far more active during rest than they are when they're responding to the external world. So then the question opened up, what does that mean? And one of the directions of research that was then opened was the possibility that the brain and mind are spending a lot of their time mind-wandering. And so the argument there was that it again is this sort of fascinating interdisciplinary moment of cognitive psychology didn't really have the tools and the paradigms to understand mind-wandering, because it had spent so many of the previous decades developing incredibly sophisticated ways of responding, designing experiments that would parse reactions to external stimuli. Arguably, particularly the humanities and the arts, there's centuries of literature that try and represent and account for processes of mind-wandering. Modernist literature, but not just modernist literature. Many philosophers, they're very strong accounts in Locke and Hume about the mind that is detached from the external world. So that again became this interdisciplinary space of thinking what would it mean to bring social scientists, humanities scholars into engagement with laboratory scientists. Okay, what happened? Yeah, I don't think I'm going to have time to say anything more about hearing the voice. Those are some of the initial questions that were addressed. And again, I suppose just the logics of how interdisciplinary projects might unfold and how to deal with the difficulty of certain kinds of explorations not being adjudicated as important in different disciplines. So obviously for psychiatry, it was very important to get an argument about interdisciplinarity into one of the key psychiatric journals, Schizophrenia Bulletin, because that would mean that the schizophrenia researchers would at least engage with the possibility of bringing on board film studies experts, medieval scholars, which you often don't see in Schizophrenia Bulletin. But then it was equally important actually to do some empirical work so that it moved beyond simply being a kind of theoretical argument for doing interdisciplinary scholarship. So on the right was an empirical paper that brought together a phenomenological philosopher, psychologist, cultural studies person, and me, social scientist, and two psychologists. Okay, and again, so for those of you interested in the actual practices of interdisciplinarity, and I think this is not simply because I was trained as a geographer, I think the question of space, both physical space and the models of space that are used to attempt to account for interdisciplinarity are very important. The Wellcome Trust, which is one of the largest funders of health research in the world, decided a few years ago to create an open plan space, which is on the right, called the Hub, to bring in 2-year residences to address any topic that might in some way be focused on health and well-being in humans and or animals, human animals or other animals. And so the project that I directed, we were the first residency. And so it was an experiment both for the funder and for us. And there's something also really wonderful and fascinating and difficult about living, the funder living with you and you living with your funder in terms of that interdisciplinary collaboration. And so I've just finished that project. And I suppose it's worth saying, not remotely, that spaces are ever neutral, but there is something to be said for the spaces that are not owned by a single discipline. So the Hearing the Voice project in Durham uses the space in the Institute of Advanced Studies, which is an interdisciplinary space. It's not owned by a department, and the Hub was specifically set out as a space that would not be in an existing division. Okay. I think I'll just move through these quickly because I'm going to otherwise run out of time. So, and this is some of the ways in which we, the investigators, the smaller group of investigators who held the grant, went about putting the project together. So REST is usually explored through its opposites. There's actually relatively small amounts of work in any discipline done on rest itself. There's a lot of stuff on resting state of organisms, but even work such as on the rest cure doesn't necessarily often grapple with what exactly rest is. And I suppose the starting point was that rest cannot be understood unless you actually attend to how its so-called opposites are operationalized. And so some of the initial questions that we started thinking with and through, I've put a few of them up. And then researchers worked within and across these spheres. So the artists were not simply, they produced a lot of interesting and I hope and I believe high quality art, musical compositions, poetry, video, sound, radio work. But they also participated in some of the experiments. So their experimental practices of composition actually then, in some ways, transformed some of the psychological experiments that we were also putting together. So I suppose that's what I'm interested in, those moments where you get those somewhat unexpected moments of disruption that work counter to what you were actually expecting by bringing people from different disciplines together. And again, this was some of our initial kind of not storyboards, but just thinking through how, the scales, this is always such a problematic slide because I'm not remotely saying brain and mind and body should be separated out, but it was a useful heuristic. The scales at which rest can be explored and the methods, the genres, the forms through which we might try and investigate rest. And these are some of the things, a lot of the research is in the process of being written up at the moment. This was one of the early papers that was trying, again, to sort of bring qualitative methods in a part of psychology that works very differently from most tightly constrained psychological experiments into contact with neuroscientific work. And then also thinking in the sort of long durée, what might it mean to bring medieval practices, devotional practices around rest and mind wandering into contact with 19th, 20th and 21st century processes. trying to rethink the way in which across the 20th century, so you have this incredibly rich interdisciplinary moment in the first half of the 20th century where urban scholars and epidemiologists and psychiatrists are very intertwined in trying to think about the space of the city. And then at a certain point, certainly by the 1970s and the 1980s, a lot of psychiatrists have completely lost touch with that sociological legacy and that urban legacy, and vice versa. So again, how do you rethink the 20th century project of understanding restlessness and rest and psychopathology, both through sociology and through epidemiology, epidemiological psychiatry. And then we've done a lot of work on the way in which the actual category of unemployment, which at certain other moments has been framed as a kind of idleness and a certain kind of enforced rest. I mean, practices of workfare, which I mentioned in Clinton's inauguration speech. I don't know how it is in your country, but certainly in Britain, if you're unemployed and trying to claim benefits, you're probably some of the busiest people out there in terms of what you actually have to do to try and claim social security benefits. So again, the question of what is work and what is rest is in the process of being profoundly transformed. Again, we don't actually have we're missing a theologian, but of course the day of rest is a foundational moment in thinking about what rest might mean. And then we did this big interdisciplinary survey, which I won't have time to go through. Okay, so let me just say a little bit more about experiment before opening up to larger questions. So what is going on by turning back to experiment? Certainly where I was coming from, and again, thinking about the moment of 1996, 1997, a lot of the interpretive social sciences and the humanities at that point very much stood on the outside of psychiatry, cognitive neuroscience. So there was a lot of incredibly careful historical and critical work being done on how those other disciplines were transforming understandings of the brain and mind. But there was arguably little real interdisciplinary engagement in the making of that research. I think there was a lot of multidisciplinary work going on, but I would argue that a lot of multidisciplinary work is not necessarily really challenging the models in either discipline. It's kind of a twin track understanding. So my colleague Des Fitzgerald and I were struck by how, although there was so much critical and conceptual discussion about the relation between the social and the neurosciences, there was very little attention to how methodological novelty, serendipity, and contingency might actually create a more constructive space of collaboration. And so that's when we started to think about experiment and the strangeness of experiment. And I'm thinking back to yesterday. I had so many, my mind is full of so many thoughts. I can't actually remember quite who said this. But we were talking yesterday about, now I can't even remember what I was even going to refer to. We were talking about the legacy of it. Oh, yes. We were talking about turning, it was a wonderful jointly given paper in the beginning of the day, that not necessarily starting with the unit of the discipline as such. And I suppose for me, a lot of the most compelling work in the history of science has looked at how experimentation, transformation through experimentation does not operate at the level of discipline. I'm thinking in particular of the extraordinary scholarship of Hans-Jörg Heimberger, who has argued that if we want to understand how new knowledge practices are formed and happen, it's not necessarily that useful to focus our gaze at the scale of disciplines, but to look at the smaller scale, what he calls experimental systems, and in Reinberger's words, to be alert to the digressions and transgressions of smaller research units below the level of disciplines, in which knowledge has not yet become labelled and classified, and in which new forms of knowledge can take shape at any time. Novelties generated in one system can quickly spread and create effects at other places. Perfect. And so, again, I think that I'm interested whether you think about experimentation in the laboratory or social scientific experiments, observational or other forms of social scientific experiments. What might it mean to try and think about possibilities of digression and transgression where knowledge has not yet become labelled and classified, where things might unfold differently from how the protocols might imagine them to be doing so? Okay, given that I've got 5 more minutes, so just to finish off the experimental entanglement section. So by arguing for these experimental entanglements, that argument is about trying to intensify the energy that is already present in any experimental system. By, for example, seeding experiments and research projects with researchers carrying heterogeneous modes of practice from the social sciences, humanities, and the natural sciences. What might it mean to expand the styles in which measurements are taken, how instruments are used, how research subjects are positioned in the experiment? How can you tinker with protocols? How can you tinker with practices of analysis by bringing different people together to see what energies might actually be set free in some way to try and, I suppose, harness that promise, the liveliness of an interdisciplinary space. Okay. I'm now going to, and I haven't had a chance to talk about the difficulties and the effective tenor of interdisciplinarity, which I think is also central to, because I'm so interested in the space, those moments of disruption. And moments of disruption are often very affectively fraught moments. So if we have time in questions, I'd love to talk more about that. So that section is now over. I'm now going to make some probably what sound like incredibly sweeping statements about where my own thinking about experiment or what, I mean, has experimented in my own work, and I'm not saying that people should think experimentally, but I suppose as a social scientist and as someone who's also been trained as a humanities scholar, where I think our interdisciplinary futures might be taking us. So, again, returning to, so the experience of living in the UK in the last 2 years has been profoundly disturbing in a way that I cannot remember ever having felt so disturbed. And the Bosnian-born fiction writer Alexander Hemon published an essay this week, obviously relating to the Trump inauguration, in which he reflects on today's sense of ontological slippage. And these are Hemon's words. Societies generate realities and present them as self-evident. But when there is, Hemon argues, a major rupture, the whole structure of self-evidence falls apart, and the shock exposes how badly it has been maintained. But, he goes on to say, people will desperately negotiate for the durability of the old, for as long as they can, including forever. They are afraid that if they lose the reality that has defined them, they will taste the state of non-being. They will experience the undoing of their solid selves, which they felt was as indestructible as reality itself. And I suppose I would argue at this moment that it's also the social sciences, as well as societies in general, that generate realities. We as social scientists generate models, theories, accounts that are themselves realities of the world. And in some ways they become self-evident and also desperately negotiate for their durability. And I suppose the question for me, for us, at the moment is what structures of self-evidence seem to be in the process of, if not totally falling apart, being under severe pressure. And some of the terms are under incredible duress. Notions of the public, the social compact, the welfare state, evidence, the poll as a classic social scientific invention of the last 2 centuries, polling, statistics, the very concept of liberalism, the very concept and practice of the elite. So there is for social scientists now, I think, the equivalent of the question that was also raised, I think, by David Byrne yesterday, the question that the British Queen famously asked economists at the LSE after the economic shocks of 2008, why did none of you anticipate it? And I think that is a question for us today in 2017. What did we, as all kinds of social scientists sitting here in this room today, fail to theorize, fail to see as the events of the last year or so have unfolded? And I'm not, obviously some people did anticipate it, but I think the shock that has been unleashed upon many of us means that many of us didn't see it. So in returning finally, and I know it's 40 minutes, I'm just going to read out 6 sentences about when I reread the 1996 Gulbenkian report and thought about where we might be now. These are 6 things to think with, to disagree with, radically to protest. I think the question of the future of the university as a space for scholarly research and the production of knowledge remains as pressing as ever, which was very clear in the 1996 report. How social scientists might analyze and intervene in the fraying of the link between statistics and governance that was so prominent in the making of the social sciences in the 19th and 20th centuries. If statistics are no longer trusted, what does that mean for the social sciences, in short? The intertwinement of the social and the biological. We cannot, as social scientists, leave biology to the life sciences. And I think that raises huge questions for what sociology, geography, anthropology looks like in the 21st century. The role of affect and emotion in the making and the unmaking of identities, groups, and states. Our current political and social moment is a deeply visceral, zigzagging polity where grievance, victimhood, revenge, hurt, identification are potent forces in making and unmaking identities, groups, and nations. And again, I think that the archive of the human sciences over the 20th century gives us a lot to work with to understand what is going on, but I think that is an ongoing, urgent task. And finally, the very prescient statement in the 1996 report, how to reinsert time and space as internal variables constitutive of analyses and not unchanging physical realities within which the social universe exists. I think that claim, for me, remains absolutely critical to our work. So those are my 6 statements to be going on with. In closing, I suppose my hope for creative experimentation, because that report, the 1996 report, also says, where are the spaces for creative experimentation? Creative experimentation does hold the possibility of arranging things differently. For me, that means staying with incommensurabilities, methodological approaches that often cannot be translated one into the other. And I think this means really opening the logics, the spatial models, and that we use to understand interdisciplinarity. So entanglement is spatial, opening, closing, we've heard a lot about imperialism. I think the spatial logics of our models really matter. As a cultural and social theorist, Elizabeth Wilson writes, in addressing interdisciplinary research, that often doesn't, she's interested in how psychoanalysis and cognitive science can't really be put together. And I'm going to close with a quotation from her. We need to keep in mind that the more things correspond in a linear fashion, the more they line up, match up, and ratify each other, the less we have moved from the place where we began. So I suppose my interest is in not necessarily lining things up. Thank you.
So in a wonderful talk to open today's session, Felicity's allowed our minds to wander through all sorts of disciplines, and she's addressed both contemporary events and reflected back on some of the messages from the Open the Social Sciences publication. We do have a few minutes for questions. Do we have a microphone in the room? If not, I think just speak up. I'll take one question here and then another one over there. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was amazed by all those interesting research proposals in Durham that you gave us an example of that are supposed to be interdisciplinary. I have a reason for my question, and the reason is this. A couple of years ago, I was present at an informal conversation. Thank you. I was present at an informal conversation between a neurologist and a cognitive psychologist. And they were talking about how the memory works. And it turned out that they couldn't talk to each other because they were using two completely different conceptual apparatuses. And as a philosopher of science, I was amazed about, well, I was amazed at that they simply couldn't sort of develop a coherent conversation. That makes one a bit pessimistic. It seems that for interdisciplinarity you need to be able to sort of tune your conceptual apparatuses to each other. So all those examples you gave of interdisciplinary research, like on auditory hallucinations and so on, you bring together all sorts of people from so many different disciplines. My first question would be, how do they talk? And my other question connected to it would be, is this interdisciplinarity or is this multidisciplinarity, which is another thing, right?
So I think it's a very important question. I am particularly thinking about, what it means to have medieval historians in the room with cognitive scientists, and I think that the temporal process of allowing people to work together is critical. I'm now ventriloquizing my medievalist colleagues. I think they would say that it took them a long time really to figure out, okay, what are the current constraints of experimentation in psychology, in cognitive neuroscience, really to be able even to begin to render legible their models of mind, body, thought from different medieval texts, often from very different centuries, how to make that even legible to a scientist. And similarly, how does that scientist, how does she make her, the ways in which she has to constrain variables, the limits of experimentation, how can that be explained to a medieval scholar working with texts? So the projects that I've talked about, many of the people have actually had a number of years working, if not together, then with very regular workshops or processes of learning together. I don't think there's any fast track way to do that. But I also think that there are many things that become possible even as the medievalist will never say that she understands fully the current exigencies of cognitive neuroscience and vice versa. But I don't think people necessarily have to always understand exactly the concepts or the vocabularies to do interesting work. I would also say that it's really important that those people can still do their own archival, scholarly, the medievalists carry on publishing in their medievalist journals as well as doing these collaborative publications.
Okay.
So it's multidisciplinary.
I would say it's both.
It's a combination, perhaps.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the next question over here, and then I'm going to take a third one from Roderick Lawrence in the centre. Olivia, if you would like us to finish on time, I will exclude you. If you have a pressing question, I'll make yours your last one. The lady behind you, thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering, if you and your colleagues were at all interested in other kinds of experiments. I'm referring specifically to field experiments and natural experiments. And I ask this because it seems like that's an area where the social scientists, ethnographers, economists might have a better understanding. So the interdisciplinarity can work backwards towards the life sciences.
I think absolutely. It's been a serendipitous. I've ended up, partly because I ended up being employed in the Institute of Psychiatry, which is now in the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience in London, and happened to start working with laboratory scientists. But I think in no way do I want to install the laboratory experiment as somehow more exemplary than other kinds of experiments. And indeed, many of my social scientist colleagues, I think, are doing precisely that in terms of natural experiments, field experiments, observational experiments.
Thank you. The next question from Robert Lawrence.
Well, thank you so much, Felicity. My question to you is, as somebody who's actually got your hands dirty doing this kind of research, is to reflect on the skills and the capacities of those who actually are managing these projects. I don't think we've talked enough about that in the literature. And it's related a bit to the first question. I think it's something more than disciplinary-based capabilities. It's this bringing together, this nurturing, this collaboration between different disciplines. Based on your own experiences, what are the key challenges?
I think it's. I'm laughing because there's so many things I could say at the moment. So epistemologically, there are challenges. I mean, if I think about the number of years that I really have struggled with trying to become proficient in the paradigms and the models and the protocols and the practices of disciplines that are at a distance from me. So, I think that we shouldn't underestimate the amount of labour that goes on there. I often feel that, and I've spoken a lot with Charles Fernyhough, who's the principal investigator of Hearing the Voice, and he has said that with interdisciplinarity, often it's so many conversations unfold, so many potential directions are opened up, and actually one of the largest challenges is how do you actually kind of corral, or how do you nurture a conversation into something that can become more than a conversation. And then I think we're back in the domain of the social sciences in terms of understanding what allows a social dynamic to unfold. So, I could also talk about, I think that there still are enormous difficulties in terms of how academia is largely organised. So for me, it was difficult in some ways taking 2 years out of, it's a challenge for a department to release someone for 2 years to do a project that is a lot of my time was actually on organising things that didn't have anything to do with the social sciences. But I think if you think about a natural scientist, some of the people wanting to apply for the Hub initiative, for example, if you take 2 years out from your own lab and potentially don't publish in the papers, in the journals you're meant to be publishing in as a, go-getting scientist, that is still a huge problem. So I think our systems of kind of reward, support are still often deeply unhelpful in allowing the time and the work and the labour to unfold that often might not result in obviously visible, to use that horrible term, outputs.
We've come to 10 o'clock. Did you have a final question, or was that your question, Olivia?
I'm actually just not going to have a question. I'll just quote you back, Felicity, to thank you for the very inspiring talk. You said how to harness the promise and the liveliness of an interdisciplinary space. And I think I will put that in the front page of our webpage for Intrepid, because it is beautifully said. So thank you.
Thank you.
And that also, I think, formed a very nice vote of thanks for Felicity's excellent contribution. I hope you're not feeling too rested after all that, but actually very stimulated to go out and enjoy the rest of the conference. Were there any housekeeping announcements before we break for coffee? Anything that we need to tell the audience? Or shall we stop for coffee and then move on to the parallel sessions at 10:15?
Maybe just one thing. There are perhaps 10 spaces for lunch within the foundation. If anyone wants to have lunch with us here, you can go to reception during coffee break, and that's available because a few people have not come, so we will release those options for others if they want to take them. Thank you.
Well, if we could show our final appreciation to our speaker, thank you. And we have a 15-minute break before the next session.